Morning, everyone. We'll give everyone another minute or two just to get everyone in the room and admitted. Okay, I think anytime you are, once we get the slides up, anytime you'd like to get going, Cheryl, looks like we have a quorum.
Thanks, Mimi. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Finance and Revenue Committee. This is our main and only meeting of this month, and then we're going to change the cadence a little bit. We'll talk a bit more about that later. So I think we'll start with roll call, and then I'll go into agenda review. I'll hand that back. Oh, Mimi, are you doing it? Okay.
Yep, I'll do it. Cheryl Ramirez.
Here.
Chunwei Chi. Mary Lou Henrik.
Here.
There you are. Hi, Mary Lou. Good morning. Richard Gibson.
Here.
Good morning. Jeff Goodman.
Here.
Good morning. Chris Hogan. Not seeing that he's here right now. John Santa. I know John's planning on joining us by phone. I don't see his phone, the phone number he gave me up there yet, so we'll hold off on that. Bethany Stairs.
Here.
Good morning. And Charlie Swanson.
Here.
Hello. All righty.
Thanks, Mimi. So we have quorum.
Yes, we do.
Okay. So I'm going to quickly review the agenda. And I'd first like to announce that as requested, we're trying to fit 3 meetings into one. So this is a packed agenda, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time introducing because HMA and Echo Northwest have a whole lot to talk to us about. So first, we're going to do an administrative cost review based on a literature review that HMA consultants did. Really interesting. And then Echo Northwest will take over with financial plan principles. They're going to go through the draft report outline. We'll hopefully mostly close the loop on expenditures, go into current funding, taxation, revenue options, and ERISA. So a lot of things to cover today. And then in the next meeting topics, we actually have a plan sketched out through December. So we'll talk about that and any other reflections you have, or maybe potentially topics we need to pick back up at our next meeting, which, by the way, is 2 weeks from today, July 1st, in our new cadence. Public comment. Do we have any public comment today? Do you know, maybe?
Oh, I'm sorry. Isabel, did anyone request public comment?
We did have 2 people sign up. I don't see either of them on the call at the moment.
Okay.
So if they join,
we'll play it by ear.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So that's our agenda, and I'll hand it over to Mimi to review the feedback from the last meeting.
Alrighty, so yes, good morning, everyone. I'll do kind of a speed, I'll do a speed review. As Cheryl said, our agenda is really packed. So one of the things that we brought back from last month's meeting was the request for further insights into the work of other committees. So I'm going to provide this monthly update on what the board and committee milestones. There was a question about how Charlie Swanson's work will be incorporated, and also how will uncertainty be incorporated, and will equity considerations be incorporated into these models. And so I think, just turning people to the memo that Echo Northwest has prepared called Financial Assumptions for Cross-Committee Alignment, which addresses these issues. And also there's a lot of other text questions that are going to be addressed in the presentation that's upcoming. As Cheryl mentioned, the request was to plan these for the planned meetings 2, 3, and 4 to be compressed into one meeting, which if you look at today's agenda, that's about what's happening. So I hope everyone ate their Wheaties this morning. And then there was a request to change the timing of the finance and revenue meetings so they fall between our board meetings, which is what we've done. So then the timing begins right in July. So our first finance and revenue meeting is actually on July 1st. That will give time for a SRA proposal to be prepared and presented to the board in case when those do come up. So F&R meetings will be held the first Tuesday of each month. And I think that is it on that. Yeah, and then just a brief committee updates. Oh, that looks like that is John Santos. So for community engagement and communications committee, they are continuing to work on a style guide for Universal Health Plan GB documents to ensure inclusive trauma-informed verbiage. Patty Wentz's contract so close to being signed. She'll be working with the board and committee on the communication plans. Plan design and revenue presented an eligibility straw proposal at the board meeting, which was approved. There's a subcommittee working on the provider reimbursement, which is a very large topic, not surprisingly. There is a long-term supports and services subcommittee. That work has just been paused temporarily until there are enough people who are able to participate it, because of the provider reimbursement subcommittee, there was some overlap. And lastly, operations. The Treasury Fund straw proposal was presented and approved at the June 12th board meeting. And for operations, one of the things that we're doing is bringing in colleagues from the Division of Financial Regulation and the Department of Justice for some of the specific questions. The Operations Committee is developing specific questions for the Milliman Consultant Group, which the initial meeting with Milliman is actually just coming up in a week. It's an informal one. It's not the official kickoff, but things are moving forward on that. And another question that was added was to ensure that Operations Committee evaluated the approach to liability and risk-based capital for Universal Health Plan operations questions. So any questions regarding that? Great, we'll move on then. Oh, and we're just gonna, we'll just go past that one. There we go. And also past the board update. Here we go.
So
We'll turn it over.
with that, we're on to the overview of the administrative costs literature review. And I'm going to just say to our presenters, you can call on people who raise their hands on your own, or I can help you however you prefer. I would assume, just like any other meeting, that our committee members can raise their hands during your presentation, ask you questions on a particular slide while it's in their minds. So I'll just ask you to call on them again, unless you want me to monitor that function. So just let me know.
That makes total sense for me. Just if I miss somebody, because I'm looking at, just a few of you on the screen. If I miss somebody, please let me know.
Will do. Thanks, Anya. Take it away.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Anya Rader-Wallach from Health Management Associates, coming to you from Rhode Island. My head is a little fogged in because I am suffering from seasonal allergies today. So hopefully I'm still lucid and I don't sneeze throughout this presentation. I have to tell you that the allergies have been really bad for the last week. I'm allergic to grasses. And so on Sunday morning, I thought I should look at the map and why I'm so affected. And so I pulled up the national allergy map, And it showed 2 spots in the country where allergies were high, where the allergy alert was high, 2 bright orange spots, Oregon and a tiny little area of Rhode Island, Cape Cod, and Long Island. So if you guys are suffering too, I am in solidarity with
Yeah, Anya, I wanted to say we have total empathy with you. I'm not surprised.
you. Anyway, so I'm going to talk today about administrative costs in the U.S. health system and what some potential reductions are under a single payer. And I'm going to say single payer with air quotes because as you all know from your work so far, there are a lot of variations on the theme of single payer, and getting to a true single payer in the US is enormously challenging because of existing programs that would have to be incorporated in any kind of programmatic design, which would necessarily, in contrast with a country like Canada that has a kind of real single payer, a single payer like system in the US is necessarily going to be more complicated. In essence, more complication equals more administrative cost. I think that's a pretty fair statement to make. So to the extent that we have to construct a system that is more complicated in order to incorporate things like a Medicare program that you probably can't just do away with, certain Medicaid rules that you probably just can't do away with, it makes the system more complicated and therefore more costly in terms of administrative costs. What do we mean by administrative costs is our starting point. You can go to the next slide, please. So administrative costs are basically the costs in our healthcare system that are not associated with the provision of actual health services or medical services. So the non-clinical costs, if you will. So that includes 2 major categories, billing and insurance related expenses and non-billing and insurance related expenses. Both of these categories of expense occur in at least 3 places. On the insurance side, so whatever the program is or the payer is, there are costs of running Medicaid, Medicare. There are costs of running an insurance company that are not related to the provision of clinical services, and those are incorporated in those programs. Providers, likewise, experience administrative costs, and those of you who are providers are quite familiar with this. And that's one of the areas that I think is least, where we are least able to specify in the US what the actual cost is, because it's sort of elusive to figure out like what's all, there are some things like, billing departments in provider offices, which are pretty clearly pure administrative functions, and therefore the costs associated with them are administrative. But there are others that are a little more gray. And the third place where administrative costs clearly occur, and a lot of it is just not documented or quantified, is at the consumer level. And any of you who have ever used the healthcare system have experienced that there can be a lot of headache, heartache, time, and expense associated with just navigating the US healthcare system. And again, that's even harder to quantify than what happens in a provider's office. But I think important to note, and I would say probably important to note that, in my opinion, has increased over time as our system has become more complicated, number one, and number two, more reliant on consumer cost sharing, as employers in particular have shifted more cost to consumers, and therefore consumers have to deal with the administrative functions associated with paying their own bills, differentiating what they owe from what they don't owe, blah, 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 that gets, that has been sort of mushrooming over time. I'm going to go to Charlie and also ask for the next, well, I'll leave it here in case Charlie's question is about this slide. Charlie.
Yeah, so I would say there's another administrative cost, and that's eligibility determination, which is a thing that is going to be maybe simplified with the state system, but universal system, but maybe not. So
Yeah,
that's
I
not
would
part of billing or non-billing, really. It's something else.
I would put that under what I just categorized as the cost of running an insurance company or the cost of running programs. But there's also an element of that that's in the employer realm, obviously. Under our current system, employers pay a whole lot to administer their plans and figure out who's eligible, who's not. Yeah, so you're right. That exists as well. All right, next slide, please. And again, I think, just an important concept to keep in mind before I move into the content of this is that this stuff is really hard to quantify, but you can bet that the more complicated the system is, the more administrative expense there is associated with it. So obviously, we all want to make it as simple as possible, but there are some real barriers that we have to recognize in making it as simple as possible. And you folks in Oregon, not you folks specifically, but there have been previous efforts to quantify how much moving to a single payer like system would reduce administrative costs. There was the RAND effort in 2017 and Optimus in 2022. And you can see the estimates there. I think each of these was a legitimate effort to quantify what the savings might be. But as you're going to see as a theme throughout this presentation, there's a wide range of potential savings depending on your assumptions. So if you were looking for this presentation to bring you to a single number that you could hang your hat on, I think I'd like to disabuse you of that notion right now and have you expect that at the end of this conversation, you'll have a range of potential savings and some sense of what are the factors that influence where you fall in that range. And even then, it's very hard to get real specific. Next slide, please. More recently, there have been some estimates that have appeared either in peer-reviewed literature or gray literature. Also, well-done estimates. They tend to take sort of different approaches. For example, the Council on Healthcare Spending and Value published a study that said, what would a Canadian-style single payer in the US do to reduce administrative costs? And they said it would reduce administrative costs by 17%, which actually compared with some of the other estimates seems to be a relatively low estimate. And one of the things I want to point out, and you'll see this in my wrap up, is there are studies that estimate the reduction in administrative expense as a result of changing the system. And there are studies that estimate the reduction in total expense. And you'll see that when you combine the potential ranges on both of those factors, you come up with a pretty wide range of possibilities. The Peterson Center in 2023 didn't really estimate reductions in admin costs per se, but did say that they pulled from the literature that 25% of healthcare spending is wasteful. So this is a combination of wasteful, not value added administrative expense and also clinical expense that could be avoided if we were doing a better job of providing the right services at the right place at the right time. So that's a little bit different animal, but an interesting take from Peterson, which tends to be a fairly centrist or maybe even conservative group when it comes to estimates like this. There was another Health Affairs article that just focused on providers and how much better systems. So this was more of kind of a operational analysis of how much gets wasted because not only do we have all this administrative expense associated with billing, insurance and revenue in provider offices, but we don't do that particularly well. So highly efficient revenue cycle operations could reduce administrative expenses on the provider side by 20%. Next slide, please. Then Turner, again, this is similar to the Peterson sort of overall insurance administrative costs. 15% of that was considered to be excess, and on the provider side, about the same. Schenker found that single payer could reduce admin costs of the BIR variety from 33 to 53%. David Cutler estimated that single payer would save, and this was again a Canadian style single payer, so a much simpler system could save 100 billion in admin costs annually. Next slide, please. Part of what I'm trying to introduce you to here is that the methodologies used by these researchers really vary, and that's part of the reason you get all the different estimates. And then even if you were doing sort of apples to apples comparisons across these studies, which is really hard to do, you find that there's a pretty wide range of estimates. A couple other states have done their own estimates as they've looked at the implementation of something like a single payer. In 2013 in Vermont, this was actually something I was part of. We had John Gruber and the University of Massachusetts give us an estimate of, and this is more akin to what you folks are looking at. It was sort of, if we move to a system that is designed this way and it's simplified, but it doesn't do away with the Medicare program, it doesn't entirely do away with, you know, VA, parts of Medicaid, et cetera, how much could we reduce? And so these are fairly conservative estimates from Vermont, but that's based on the direction we gave the contractor, which is be realistic about how much we're actually simplifying the system. So I often liked then to talk about the Vermont system as a publicly financed system, because if you call it single payer, people think it's really simple. And as you guys are finding out, it can't actually in reality be all that simple, or as simple as we would want. Washington, similarly in 2021, looked at what they could reduce their administrative costs for under a single payer like system, similar to Vermont. So different starting place, but essentially both states said we could cut our admin costs in half if we went to a simpler system. Next slide, please. So the summary, again, estimates vary greatly, but there's broad agreement that a single payer or single payer like system would reduce administrative costs significantly. More complicated equals more cost continuing to live in the system. Those costs are experienced, as we said, at the program level, at the payer level, at the provider level, and at the consumer level. And they are related not only to the cost of processing bills, which is a lot of it, but as Charlie pointed out, also things like eligibility systems, which could be greatly simplified if there were simpler rules and fewer programs with varying rules. In essence, actually, one thing I wanted to throw in before I wrap up is if you think about, there's a range in the existing US system today of estimated administrative expenses. Commercial payers tend to have the highest administrative expenses. And then Medicaid and Medicare tend to have much lower expenses. That can be a little misleading, I think, when folks take a look at those and try to, again, make an apples to apples comparison across payers. One of the things that sometimes gets missed in Medicaid in particular is there's a difference between Medicaid managed care states and Medicaid states that are not managed care. There aren't nearly as many states that do not use managed care these days. But in states where they use managed care, the administrative costs tend to be much like a commercial payer. So, for example, in Rhode Island, when I ran the Medicaid program, we were paying our Medicaid MCOs 8-9% administrative expense overhead on top of the premiums that they were, or on top of the clinical costs that they were paying for. And oftentimes, if you look at just the straight government side of Medicaid or Medicare, it's a really low number, like low single digits. I think what can be misleading there, at least on the Medicaid side, is that, or that can be viewed as positive when I don't necessarily think it should be viewed as entirely positive, is a lot of times Medicaid programs are starved administratively. And if you look at, again, I'll use my Rhode Island example, about a third of the Rhode Island population is covered by Medicaid. A little more than that is covered by Blue Cross Blue Shield. The Rhode Island Medicaid program has a way far fewer employees and expenditures related to administering services for that third of the population than a Blue Cross or a United has for administering their chunk of the system. So the bottom line estimates are on the administrative side, low estimates or savings of as much as 15% of administrative costs. So of that part of the system that is administrative costs, a good way of thinking about it may be like if you sort of round it up to 10% and you said 10% of the system is administrative costs, then 15% of that 10% would be the savings that you could potentially reap. And that, again, that's super conservative. And I think most people would think we could do better than that. On the high end, estimates are as high as 15% of total healthcare costs. So again, huge range, different measurement methodologies, different assumptions. Clearly there's something to save, but that's, you can't say a whole lot more about the consensus around this. And Richard, wanted to go to you.
Yeah, thanks to HMA for putting together the literature review. It was really hard to gather information from those studies because they were comparing a percent of total costs versus percent of admin costs versus percent of billing insurance related costs. And so they're using different baselines. Sometimes it was presented in percentage versus dollar amounts.
Yep.
Then there was a breakup between provider and payer versus total. That was really hard to correlate. Sometimes reductions were, or sometimes administrative costs were presented as percentage reduction versus percentage of the total amount that remains. There was comparisons to other countries, which may also have their own administrative simplifications. Then a lot of the studies worked at specific aspects of administrative costs, like eligibility or extra time in the electronic health record. But some, even like in Washington, they said they're going to reduce it. They could reduce it from 8% to 4% of administrative costs. I mean, that on the face of it just doesn't make sense. I mean, so many of the articles were talking about 25, 30% in provider offices, and that's just the provider side. And then looking at the huge expense of insurance, it's just, some of those are so low that they just I don't think can be believed. I mean, I'm not a researcher in it, but I have to be skeptical if someone says, well, we can lower admin costs from 8% to 4%. I don't think that's useful to our efforts here. Over.
Thanks. No, that's a good summary. You can't, it's really hard to make comparisons across this array of studies. I would say, based on the Vermont experience that I was involved in, part of what we tried to do is be very, as I said, really realistic. If providers still had to deal with Medicare as a separate program,
Yeah.
If they still had to deal with Medicaid as a separate program, if the VA still existed as a separate program, really what we were doing is reducing the administrative complexity around commercial insurance. And so we tried to sort of draw a fence around that and say, what can we save? And we may still have been too conservative. I'll say there is an interplay between the facts and the politics of the situation too, which is if you say to providers, we're going to pull 20% out of your total revenues because you don't need that anymore because we've assumed you can reduce your administrative expenses by that. You get a lot of pushback. So that was the other factor, which I assume also came into play in Washington. Cheryl.
Given the variability of the methodologies used in these studies and, you know, the issues that Richard pointed out and you've pointed out, do you have any recommendations for us on what estimate to use for administrative cost savings?
I would, I think I'm not trying to avoid the question, but I would say rather than setting your sights on any particular estimate that's in the literature, use that as background. But more importantly, give your contractors the tightest assumptions you can about how the system's going to work vis-a-vis reductions in complexity. Because I think otherwise you're going to come up with something, you know, potentially similar to Vermont or Washington. But if you can say, no, we're going to do this thing differently or that thing differently, and some of that, you know, at this point in your process, you may not be able to do because if this program is to come to fruition, you've got a giant negotiation with the federal government that has to happen. And a lot of the complexity, as I've alluded to, that continues in the system is because the feds might not be flexible. And if there's the allowance for more flexibility, well, then there's the possibility for greater administrative savings.
Okay, thanks, Sonia.
I'm not sure that's very satisfying, but maybe it gives you sort of some
It's a
touch.
start.
Yeah, it's like, what did the literature say?
Mm-hmm.
What are we doing that's actually going to have an impact on the complexity of the system? And then what do we not know because we don't know how much federal relief we will get from federal programmatic reports that add to that complexity.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome. Jeff.
I'll defer to Charlie.
Charlie, he cedes his time to you.
Okay.
Then you can come back.
Okay, thanks. So I really have more of a comment than a question. It relates to what Anya just said about complexity from the federal government. So one of the things that can simplify a lot, and this is related to what I talked about a little bit ago, that the federal programs require eligibility determinations now. They may, or we may be able to negotiate out of that. We may not want to negotiate out of that. So that's going to be an important piece of it. Because, I mean, in essence, what we're saying is everybody's eligible, and we want to incorporate Medicare and Medicaid into our program, but we want to get those dollars from the feds. And so, are the feds going to say, well, you can just get a prorated amount based upon what you have now and keep it similar to what other states are doing when they get their money for Medicaid and Medicaid? Or maybe they're going to say, no, you really have to do eligibility determinations for everybody and to see what we're going to provide for that. So that's going to be a big deal about, are we going to have to do eligibility determinations or not? Because that is a fairly big expense, and also, I mean, not just for the system, but also for the individuals who have to become eligible. So that's going to be a big part of our questions, and it's sort of an operations question as well. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and to me, it's not just eligibility; it's also claims processing. There have been Medicaid waivers that allow for a lot more flexibility around going back to very specific claims in order for the state to get the amount of money that was essentially agreed to under their 1115 waiver. So it's plausible that there's some flexibilities there, but claims processing is a huge expense in the system too. And if you both have to, in order to incorporate Medicaid and continue to have the dollars flow from the feds, if you have to prove that every individual who would have been eligible for Medicaid is still eligible for Medicaid, and you have to process claims to show that the expenses associated with those people are legit for for claiming federal financial participation, then you haven't gotten rid of a lot of administrative expense. But hopefully you could encounter a reality in which at least some of that could go away. Jeff.
I agree with what Anya and Charlie are bringing up about the potential to reduce administrative costs, even if we get the waivers from Medicaid and Medicare. Just given the nature of large bureaucratic organizations, and don't get me wrong, I prefer bureaucracy to dictator. But just given the very nature of those organizations and our ability to get a waiver, I think the administrative costs, we should be very cautious as to the estimate of the percentage that we might save for the reasons that Anya has identified and that Charlie has also referred to.
Yeah. And I'll just one more thing I'll add about Medicare is, so we presented to, now I think it was the Plan Design Committee, not this committee, but forgive me if it was this committee. HMA did a presentation on waivers, and we talked a little bit about Medicare waivers. There's very little that's available to states or providers by way of Medicare waivers. And one of the frustrations that providers have had, for example, providers who have gone into the accountable care organization models across the country, is that the Medicare didn't really allow for a lot of administrative simplification. So there was sort of a budgeting function that was overlaid on the current system, but providers still had to submit fee-for-service claims and had to go through a reconciliation process that was very complicated, very costly, and very slow, so that to the extent that those models were supposed to be changing the incentives in the system, it took like 12 to 18 months to reconcile actual experience with the predictions under the waiver model. And so, that's part of the reason I think that that Medicare Advantage has sort of become so kind of proliferated across the country, because it is a somewhat simpler model from the provider and payer perspective. There actually is an ability to get away from fee-for-service claims processing. Not that I'm advocating that we do anything around Medicare Advantage, but something like that, where you actually could have a simpler payment mechanism in addition to a simpler eligibility and enrollment mechanism, would also make a big difference. All right, that is the sum total of my presentation. Thanks for the good questions, and feel free to follow up if you have additional ones.
Thanks very much, Anya. Really appreciate that information. It was really helpful. So we'll move to Echo Northwest. I think they've got like a series of maybe 3 presentations next. So I'll hand it over to Morgan.
Thank you, Cheryl. And thank you very much, committee members, for the great meeting in May and just helping us get organized and some feedback on sort of the pace and substance that we're going to cover here. So I'm going to, Cheryl, remind me again too, just when we're taking a break, but I will have a handful of things here. I'm just looking for some preliminary feedback, but we'll also invite you to provide more detailed feedback to Cheryl and Mimi after the meeting. So
Morgan, just real quick, it looks like we're right on schedule, and I believe our break is scheduled for 10:30.
10:30, great. I should be able to get through this part, and then hopefully at least the majority of our discussion on expenditures and our cost target. So the first thing I wanted to share with you, you guys gave us a little bit of permission to take your principles for a viable and just financing approach and to rework that. And so we took a crack at this, and I would say I kind of put this into almost 3 products, and the thing I did here was to hopefully simplify a little bit your principles and try to define these things in a very a straightforward way. I then wanted to make sure that we added evaluation criteria, and the purpose of the evaluation criteria were for us to answer our own set of principles with our recommendations, and by our, I mean your recommendations, excuse me. And that when we design scenarios, when we design, and do our analysis and report back our findings, and then ultimately recommend an approach to the overall board, that we kind of feel like we've addressed these questions. And so the first one here is I have.
Before we go on, could you make that bigger?
Yeah,
could you-
sorry. Let me know. How's that, Charlie?
A little bigger even.
Okay.
Yeah,
That
that's
better?
getting there.
Okay.
Yeah, much
Okay, here we
better.
go. I'll fill out the screen here.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the first one here is clarity and transparency. And the evaluation criteria I felt were like, we needed to make sure we have it's comprehensible, right? That people should be able to understand it pretty simply. We should be able to document our work and have sort of traceability to the base information, and that it has some good comparability to the existing system. So I think that there's very simple ways around clarity and transparency. I'll try to move through these quickly. If people have questions immediately, go ahead and raise your hand and I'll stop and pause. The next piece is about equity and, oh, go ahead, Charlie. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. So, I mean, I think those are all useful evaluation criteria, but I also think that we need to be a little bit flexible on it. I mean, can the plan structure be explained with clear visuals or summaries? I mean, maybe, but I think it's more important to have a good plan than it is to have an explainable plan. And so I think we want to be able to say, well, yeah, it doesn't so great on that, but it's that way for a reason. And I'm not sure about the documentation of tax bases. I mean, part of what you have to, at least from our standpoint, we have to look at is how much is currently raised in taxes from various income levels. And there's lots of details in there. And yeah, the information is publicly available, sort of, but I'm not quite sure how you evaluate whether we've gotten appropriately simple enough and well documented enough. But so I think we want to be careful about, these are ideals that there'd be other things that will say we may not be able to meet all of the ones that are here.
Yeah, no, I think you raise a really great point. And kind of looking at this, right? Principles themselves aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, right? And I think a lot of what it was in your own document, in your own work there, right, is intention, right? And so, and I think your point about the ideals is really what I'm trying to get at with the criteria. Not that we would turn this into a scoring rubric. I mean, you could, but I think that's probably not necessary. But to me, it's really to raise the question. And so when people ask why, why is it not? Because we're trading that off with another and more important principle, like the substance of the plan relative to its sort of maybe easily explanation, right? You're not trying to maximize one principle necessarily at the expense of the others always. So I think so I would say, to me, it's really like, are these really the kind of right questions to be asking when we evaluate, not necessarily like as a principle to sort of maximize. The next one, a key piece, is equity and progressivity. And so this is really about a very clear statement you have: the system must be progressive and based on ability to pay. From a technical evaluation criteria, I think it's making sure that we are being comprehensive about what we're counting as income and wealth, and making sure we understand that. We tend to think of these mostly as sort of pay or tax bases, but that necessarily isn't always kind of a question of wealth. And then are we applying the right sort of distributional as well as progressivity metrics? These are technical questions I think you really want to evaluate when you say like the principle is about progressivity with respect to equity. The next one is fiscal stability and permanence. So revenue sources must be stable, predictable, and sustainable across economic cycles. There is both a sort of technical way we can look at this and with respect to diversification, volatility, elasticity, but then there are also more sort of practical questions we can ask with respect to contingencies and other types of things. So to me, those have felt like kind of the key sort of questions we want to be asking with that principle. Oh, go ahead, Charlie.
So related to fiscal stability, under the evaluation criteria, I think we want to include something about is there sufficient ways to make up for the volatility that will necessarily exist? For example, are there ways and methods of getting bonding to finance the system? What's the criteria for reserves? So I'm not quite sure how to say it right now, but something in the evaluation criteria say, how can we make up for the fact that it isn't as stable and predictable as we would like?
Thank you. So scalability, flexibility, financing must support phased implementation and system evolution. This was a very clear piece of understanding that there is a transition, and then will be some phase of reflective learning as the plan evolves. And so what we the questions here are really about phase alignment. So basically, do we understand this question, like as Charlie said, about reserves relative to sort of ongoing operations? Are we talking about adaptability, modularity? Are these fallback scenarios? I think a little bit of kind of, Charlie, some of your points you just raised, we're trying to pull into this question around this principle around phased implementation and system evolution. So there's some crossover there. Great. Next one, legal viability. The financing must be resilient to legal challenges, particularly under federal ERISA law. So we have to make sure that we are some analysis has been done to determine our compliance with ERISA and other federal statutes. We have some assessment of employer neutrality, so that any structured revenue mechanisms as taxes or assessments avoid any of those mandates on employers. We must have to make sure that we have precedent review, that there's no obviously whatever proposal incorporates lessons and other kind of legal rulings, and that we've also considered alternative structures if we believe that there is some sort of legal sort of risk assessment. Great. Much like the Joint Task Force, funds must be isolated. There's a sort of dedicated healthcare trust fund principle that funds must be isolated from the general fund and used only for healthcare. Valuation criteria are really about the structure, revenue flow, oversight, and firewalls, or kind of the key criteria we should be asking ourselves with respect to the structure. Okay, go ahead, Charlie.
And so this brings up a question that we're still hoping to get an answer for, as far as I know, and a legal question that probably is not within your purview, but that's, can we actually raise money based on income and individual income in Oregon that is not subject to the kicker? And so I just want to remind us that that's a really fundamental question that, as far as I know, we still need an answer for.
I'll just jump in there, Charlie, that yes, that the operations committee is aware of that and working with starting to work with DOJ and DFR as well. So it is not gone unnoticed.
Yep. The next principle is about the optimization of federal funds. So that the principle is that we maximize the federal contributions and avoid any funding or eligibility cliffs for recipients. So making sure that the proposal identifies and incorporates all the federal funding streams, that those are appropriately levered, that we have sort of a waiver strategy or with respect to enable the integration and redirection of those funds, that there's some sort of cliff avoidance is kind of what I'm calling it. So basically, we looked at the transition points to avoid any sudden losses of benefits or large tax jumps at specific income thresholds. And so this is both on the benefit side, but also on the taxation side, and that there is some coordination that we're asking our state and federal tax and benefit interactions to analyze to prevent any duplications or unattended cost shifts. So any other criteria or questions on this one? Okay, a comprehensive and broad-based revenue model. So here, I think we're looking that the funding must reflect the full cost of the plan and be drawn from a diverse set of sources. And this is really about the way we construct our revenue scenarios and cost coverage with respect to both just the ongoing part of funding the plan, but also that there is a specific strategy about reserve planning, both initial capitalization as well as stabilization of the funds going forward. There is a principle about economic neutrality and efficiency. So here, minimize adverse economic impacts and preserve federal tax preferences where possible. So and this is really the heart of a lot of the work that ECHO will be doing, is making sure that we also look at the impact of the proposals on employment, wages, business costs, productivity, so that we're not making productive and unintended consequences, that we've looked at potential migration effects, particularly with respect to individual business relocation at key income or profit thresholds, depending on the proposal. Look at the interaction of tax preferences, and then wherever possible, have we kind of looked at any kind of neutrality tests. And so basically evaluating for any distortions to labor supply, retirement planning, or employment behavior. So to me, I think this is a real big question that I think we'll want to come back with these as we do the economic analysis. Great. So those were I would say I took the principles and put them into 9 with evaluation criteria. We don't have to spend a little more time. I think there were other pieces in there. I simply pulled these out. To me, you guys had some great I'll call them research conditions and technical standards for doing the work with respect to data quality, reliability, accounting, transparency, uncertainty, risk disclosure, called temporal validity, looking at stuff of data that might have been collected during odd times, comparability, savings, and consolidation estimates. So all of this, I would say, I just kind of mined this, that kind of pulling out the principles from what I would call kind of more direction about how the Finance and Revenue Committee should be conducting itself. Okay. Any questions on this? But to me, I think this can live as a living document, but we will sort of start moving it into our final product. Go ahead, Charlie.
Just wondering, so this one we probably want to look at more carefully after the meeting. And so if we have comments, this is maybe a question for Cheryl or Mimi. To whom do we send comments or questions or concerns?
Send any comments or questions on this directly to Mimi. And then she will route them to us, and we'll consolidate this, and we'll add this as a sort of just a quick check-in if necessary at our July meeting. Okay, thank you, Charlie. Oh, go ahead. Oh, go ahead. Oh, sorry. Yeah, right. De-raising hand. Okay. So the other thing I did with your document is I found things that I would call them flagging them, things that were going to be important for finance and revenue, but probably from a research obligation were housed in other committees. And so I put together this document. And I'll make this larger. And again, I'll cover this quickly. And then, but in chatting with Cheryl and Mimi, we thought it would be good to make sure that we documented these. Yeah, I'll pull them up. Documented what I call key financial assumptions for cross-committee alignment. So as sort of Charlie raised the question around the legality around taxation of income and the kicker law, we thought these were also really important things that should be flagged for other ones. So basically, probably not a complete list of everything you've raised, but at least in terms of what I found in the document and some of the past meetings,
Still larger if you can.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the first one, covered populations and services must be clearly designed. So for plan design, a really important one. Implementation phasing must match funding capacity. Financing design must avoid legal conflicts with ERISA. A dedicated trust fund is required. Federal program integration must be seamless. Workforce and economic behavior will likely shift. Common data sources and time periods are essential in the work. The state kicker law may affect revenue stability. Administrative costs must be accurately estimated. And then reserves and existing program funds need a transition plan. So willing to take comments on other things you would like to add to this, but I think Cheryl, correct me if I'm wrong, and Mimi, the idea was to finalize this as a sort of, call it, living working document that we may revise as necessary, but to sort of use this as communication to the other committees and the board and the overall board.
Morgan, do you see this going out to those other committees soon, or, I mean, is there a
I think, as Charlie said, we want to give folks a little bit of time to kind
Okay.
of provide any comment or edits to this as necessary. But I would, Mimi, I would assume that we probably would want to finalize relatively soon.
Yeah, or at least there's an operations committee meeting coming up on the 26th. I'd like to be able to share it with them. It may not be the final
Draft.
form, but I think
Uh-huh.
that would
Okay.
be, yeah.
So just like with everything else, the comments and questions go to Mimi.
Mary Lou?
It's already online under meeting documents for today. So any other committees or anybody else in the world that wants to read it, I've already printed it out, so it's there, just commenting.
Yes, yeah, we shared the draft.
Not secret, yeah.
I wanted to make sure I was mostly working off of your past materials as a group, and just want to make sure I was accurately sort of documenting that. And then obviously if there are other things that we've missed, we want to make sure it'll be a little more comprehensive.
Anyway, that's all.
Great. All right. Any last questions on this one? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next piece. Great. So the other piece here is just in terms of efficiency and making sure that we are documenting all the work of the committee. We went and prepared a draft outline that we will start writing to immediately, trying to document the work that you've already done, and so that you can kind of see, like, well, what are we actually saying when we actually take the conversation and put pen to paper. So I just want to spend a little time just talking about a little bit of overall structure and flow. I'll make this large again. So table of contents, I think generally pretty straightforward. We want to talk a little bit about the introduction and background, talk specifically about the committee charge, what it was asked to do, its documentation of its work plan, the things that it covered. We want to then spend a little time with, I think, what I called kind of the research framework and core domains of inquiry. So these are kind of the tasks that the finance and revenue was charged with, and then specifically move into the recommendations, and then any technical appendices after that. Always good to have a submission letter. So I started a draft of the submission letter. We'll probably want to make this much more detailed as we move forward. Some executive summary of the work and its recommendations. Here, in terms of the introduction and background, purpose of the committee, relationship to the broader Universal Health Plan implementation, your guiding values and operating assumptions. So much of that letter of the sound of a viable and just financing plan will be pulled into this. The next piece is just to lay out the official charge from the board, the structure of your work, those both meeting framework and topics covered, just so people have a sort of quick guide layout of the ground that you've covered. And here we wanted to then flip right to your sort of research framework and core domains of inquiry. So attributes of a sound financial plan, baseline spending review, cost target setting, cost estimation, revenue design, and legal compliance, where we talk about the revenue, tax design criteria, legal constraints, distributional economic impacts. So that's much of the work still to come forward. So our startup and operational readiness set of research tasks, our transition and scenario planning. So how do we actually kind of move and talk about phasing, and then some discussion of future governance around plan monitoring and recalibration, are kind of the core areas that we've mapped out in terms of the tasks. Then moving towards our recommendations for the Finance and Revenue Committee, again, preferred revenue framework. There may be other alternatives that you may want to also put forward and discuss why. Talk a little bit about legal design features. We'll talk about the distributional equity and any mitigation that you have. We'll actually recommend a startup and reserve strategy as well as a transition plan. So those are the key pieces that you've been asked to provide recommendations on. Appendices, generally, right, I think for the most part, a lot of it is just born from the work that has been done to date, as well as the remaining work going forward. So go ahead, Charlie.
I'm just looking at this, I'm thinking this looks pretty good and pretty comprehensive, and also I don't think doable in the time frame that we're currently planning. So I'm just pointing out there's a lot to do here.
I won't disagree with you about being a lot to do. And we'll obviously talk about the timing here as we move forward with the work. Okay. Again, so no need to sort of opine or get feedback yet. We'll be kind of building this out, and I imagine as we continue to write and start taking your work to date and publishing it, we'll work with Cheryl and Mimi to figure out the right places and for review, so that you can have both sort of editorial and sort of wordsmith control over that. But we want to make sure that's efficient and not duplicative. So, all right, great. So there's that. Okay, now I think we'll spend our time before the break here diving into the expenditure work and cost target pieces. So okay, so this is the work of my colleague, Will Terry. Will's been diving into all the work that you've done, as well as the past work from RAND, the Joint Task Force, and Optimus. Just so I think we're trying to do a couple things here is to level set and make sure that we're all on the same page regarding kind of the task that you've been charged with to catalog expenditures, and then also develop a potential sort of funding target in order to sort of fund the plan. Will has spent a lot of time working with Charlie just to make sure that we fully understand the work that all the great work he's done, as well as other individuals on the consulting side, just as we get up to speed. We're trying to really in here is just identify any remaining components with respect to our expenditure or cost target estimates that still require any further refinement. We can either do that obviously immediately or in the long term, but I think mostly just want to make sure that we're up to speed here. So I would say as we kind of go through the work and say, well, why are we trying to understand how much spending is in the system. We're doing this because the finance and revenue is charged with really understanding two big things, right? With respect to how much will the plan cost and what potential funding gaps may exist. And so here I think it's really important to understand that we basically have kind of two definitions and two things we're seeking here, right? So basically one, like what's the current expenditures, and typically this is the most simple way of trying to understand how much money may be available in a prospective single payer system. And then we have to do some work to understand how much of that new revenue will need to be raised to hit the cost target if some of those dollars aren't particularly transferable to that plan moving forward. And so generally, I think there's kind of two ways to do this, and particularly the Finance and Revenue Committee has chosen a way that is just looking at the documenting of current expenditures in the system. But I think it's also useful to understand that you could do this much more directly, right? Understanding the benefit levels times the cost times the population that you're serving, one could derive an actual cost. And I know work that's being done in plan design, other pieces may be deriving some of that as they think about potentially serving different populations, as well as thinking about potentially different benefit levels. So, but given our time and the work that you've done thus far, like I think is Will's terms, a very thorny data and estimation challenge. And so Milliman will be doing some of this work, and you'll have some insight and touch point into that as you guys move forward. But instead, I think the finance and revenue is following the work of Optimus, trying to basically exploit the work that's been, a lot of the heavy lifting that's been done there, and to bring it current and within the framework that you are trying to understand with respect to your cost target. So basically, we think of this as the expenditures under the current coverage regime, less any administrative efficiency cost savings. And then we have to account for some cost to covering more, maybe generally sicker people, plus the cost of any increasing average benefit level. Go ahead, Charlie.
So I was going to say that the approach that Milliman may be able to take would be great. They're going to still have to look at the other information, the sort of total cost, because they're going to decide, well, how much are you going to pay providers for the services that are going to be in the plan? And the choice of that is going to be based upon, to a large extent, I would expect, we need to pay a common rate for everybody, and it's not currently a common rate. So what should that rate be? And so they still need all that information to get there. So
yeah, I think that's a great point, actually. Right. Okay. So I would say just mathematically, right, what we're trying to understand here is
just before you go on, Morgan, sorry, Mary Lou has her
sorry,
hand
Mary
up.
Lou.
Apologies.
Can you go back to the previous slide there? I'm just wondering about and generally sicker population. Has that been decided by somebody? Or why is it that we think that we already are covering all the low income people and Medicare is already out there? It's like kind of like, why do we think we have a sicker population?
Of folks that aren't currently covered under the existing plans, I think.
I got that.
Okay.
I got that. But I'd say in my mind, we are when we formed the Oregon Health Plan and we put in, the higher income levels and did all of that kind of thing, I think we pulled in a lot of the people who hadn't been getting care at all and were sicker. I'm just wondering where that.
Yeah, I mean, Charlie, maybe you have an answer. And then
I was going to actually agree with her that and generally sicker, I would say it is almost surely going to be the other way around.
Okay.
The people who are not covered now are, I mean, some of them are not covered by choice because they generally don't get sick. And those who do, like Mary Lou mentioned, are covered under Medicaid or go to the emergency room. And so we'll be covering it in a way that is cheaper than going to the emergency room. So I would say that it's going to be a generally healthier population that we're going to be covering.
I agree with that, Charlie.
Okay, we can leave it just to covering more people. Anya,
Yeah,
do you have
just,
any
that's
clarification?
fine. Just take out generally sicker because
Yeah.
I think that's not true.
All right. Thank you for the catch.
Thank you.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Anya.
I was just going to agree. I would take out the generally sicker. I think there are a couple of factors here. Status quo, I think you could assume that those who are out of the market are most likely to be the so-called young invincibles right now. So they would be generally healthier. But we don't know what status quo with Medicaid changes is going to be. And so that's something to keep in mind. So for example, the ACA brought in a whole lot of young males who normally would have been considered young invincibles, but they got coverage. Some of them were sicker in the sense that a lot had substance use disorders. But I don't think I think it's hard to make a generalization about several years into the future, what the risk profile of that population is going to be. But maybe you want to just put a
But
footnote.
we'll
that
get
says
we'll get rid of it. I
maybe-
think
and you
maybe
need to think
it maybe just an assumption as opposed to sort of statement of fact, so we can lose it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. So if we understand the current expenditures, right, we can turn that into a cost target by understanding the sort of savings scale, right, as it relates to sort of economies of scale with respect to sort of administrative cost savings. We can then escalate the estimates that have been done in the past to fiscal year 2026. We're using roughly a inflation factor about 1.055, which is higher than the general inflation, but it could be higher potentially. And then we then deduct any transferable funding, and that becomes the basis of our funding gap. Go ahead, Charlie.
So I think greater than or equal to 2026 is fine. I think that we're not going to be aiming for 2026, so it's more like 2030 probably.
Yeah.
But the 2026 number is going to be useful just as comparison to Optimus, I think. So I think it's important that T greater than or equal to 2026, and 2026 is only there as kind of a comparison number.
Yeah, let's bring us current to kind of some understanding of the time today. Yeah. Great. So what's our understanding of the current baseline of spending in the current system? And so that's about $55.6 billion inflated to fiscal year 26, according to the Optimus estimates in 2022. That covers roughly 94% of all Oregonians at kind of varying benefit levels and with respect to kind of their own individual state or private contributions. And so what Charlie and others have done is and what we've done here is just simply to translate that level of spending into a cost target and funding gap following the Joint Task Force methodology. And so your work thus far, right, is taking that status quo, tries to net out additional costs from broader benefit coverage levels and other cost efficiencies. And again, one of the big sort of uncertainties will be with respect to the transferable revenue, specifically around federal Medicare, Medicaid waivers, and other, obviously, the administrative efficiencies we just talked about. So Optimus estimated that roughly 34.6 billion would be transferable from existing resources to calendar year 2026, resulting in a funding gap of about $20 billion. We're going to call this the sort of Optimus scenario. Then we basically assume some similar sort of reasonable assumptions about sort of the cost growth. Some of that may be more bearish or realistic, depending on what we think, and the likelihood that maybe not all that federal Medicaid waivers may come through. I think Charlie has flagged about $2 billion in his work. We're going to call this the Swanson scenario. And then we can extrapolate that information to understand what that $55.6 billion less the fungible resources would get us to here. And that's about $22 billion of a funding gap in fiscal year 26. Charlie, then Richard.
So the $2 billion question there is, it's not really, it is related to waivers. So Optimus made the assumption that we would actually be able to get more from Medicaid once we implement our system, because there'd be more people who are eligible, those who are currently not eligible for Medicaid because they haven't bothered trying to become eligible for Medicaid, but actually would be eligible for Medicaid if we had our system. And their estimate was that we could get about another 2 billion out of Medicaid from that. So, but there's a real question, because the waivers as currently written tend to say that you can't increase the federal deficit, which would tend to mean that you can't get more money from them if you're trying to get a waiver through, say, 1322, I think it is. So that's where that 2 billion is. So it's an estimate that Optimus said we're going to get more from the federal government, and I'm thinking maybe we won't. And who knows? I mean, there's lots of uncertainty now, so there's way more uncertainty than that now. So I'll just stop there.
No, thanks, Charlie, for the additional context. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you. What assumption is made with respect to the bill working its way through Congress right now with respect to Medicaid funding? Is it assuming that it's not going to pass? Is it assuming that it's going to pass in some form? And what dollar impact might that have?
I think it's a great question. And I would say the simple answer is we've made no assumptions yet. So like a lot of this is just documenting what we've done in the past, but I think it should feature large in our thinking as we kind of move forward. And you'll see kind of some of this a little bit embedded in the next couple slides, but thank you, Jeff. So
just as a follow-on to that, I'm following on the recent article a week or so ago, and I recognize things are in flux. In the Oregonian, the estimate was it could be anywhere between $500 million to $1 billion impact on Medicaid funding in Oregon. And I think we need to be cognizant of that as we talk about just the funding gap based on current situation.
No. Go ahead, Anya.
I was just going to say, I think most people would say there's high likelihood that the bill will pass. The precise impact, I think, depends on a couple of things. One, what is the deal? And two, over time, some of the things that they're proposing, such as work requirements, will kind of have a compounded effect over time because they create administrative barriers that make it less likely for people to actually enroll in and retain coverage. So there's kind of immediate cuts, and then there's what happens to enrollment over time, and whatever happens to enrollment affects the total amount of money that's coming to Oregon. So a lot of factors in flux. And there are some good national estimates of state by state impacts, but it'll be a while before we know what to rely on.
Great. So this is just a quick summary slide here where we derive this from the Joint Task Force table, just to talk about their estimate of enrollment, the expenditures in 2019 millions, and then we've inflated that to 2026. So just a line item sort of comparison of how do we get to this $54.6 billion cost target. Again, this is just another way of kind of restating more conceptually about how that works. So the 37 in calendar year 19 minus efficiency savings plus additional folks covered at the least benefit level of the public employee benefit plan, and plus dental benefits and behavioral health benefits. That brings us then current to fiscal year 2026 and gives us that $54.6 billion cost target. So then we move to understanding what the funding gap is. And I think we're kind of outlining, think of it as basically some understanding of administrative efficiencies capture. So all of these scenarios are starting with a 4% assumption. But again, based on sort of Anya's work, we may want to contemplate higher levels of that potentially. And then I think we've kind of just mapped out, depending on different levels of transferable income vis-a-vis Medicaid and Medicare. One can think of it as basically, I think, as Jeff articulated, maybe potentially kind of you call it a no waivers or more pessimistic scenario. We have the work that Charlie's done, we're calling it, for clarity, the Swanson scenario. And then just for reference, you can see what the Optimus scenario was, where they assume basically like full transferableness of that. If we even step back a little further, here we can then understand some range between, we'll call it a kind of worst case scenario or best case scenario of our funding gap by just pivoting along the two dimensions of administrative efficiency capture as well as federal waiver percent achieved. And so this just gives you an understanding of kind of the work that's been out there. So the Optimus scenario, the Swanson scenario, but then you can kind of see in the far left there what we'll call the Joint Task Force a no waiver scenario. So anywhere from 40 to 16 billion, and some clustering at around the 20 billion. Is just a way to kind of think about the bookends of it relative to some of the other work that's been done as sort of, we'll call it kind of good reasonable estimates in this space. So here's the part of the level set and the question, and I got kind of decision that we need from the revenue committee here, right, is do we need to revise or do any additional work on our cost target? Do we feel comfortable with the data, the reasonableness of the approach, that we have comfort to say, like, yes, at the top line level, we believe that the system could cost 54.6 billion roughly. Is there additional work that we need to do there to estimate it, or potentially we can continue to do that going forward? The other two big questions I would say are really then on our funding target. So that's really about sort of transferableness with respect to how much administrative savings capture we should be embedding in our thinking. And we can obviously think about these in ranges. We don't need just one cost target, but it'd be great to have a preferred one with some additional ones that might be good about teasing out potential implications going forward and uncertainties, as well as basically different assumptions on Medicaid and Medicare transferableness. Go ahead, Charlie.
So we had sort of made within the Finance and Revenue Committee a decision earlier that we are going to actually make use of a known year, a year that we have data for at first, so that we can get good tax numbers, and so either 22 or 2023, and then move that forward. So I think I would like to see us sort of focusing on a revenue need for either 22 or 23, 2022 or 2023, probably 2022, because we have more detailed tax information available for that, and then move to 2026 later, because we're going to have to do two projections there. One is how are the medical costs going to change? Well, actually three. How are the recoverable resources going to change? And another one is, well, how is the income level, the potential taxes going to change in Oregon? So I kind of think we would stick with that we want to do a lot of work with a known year of 2022 or 2023. So
yeah, so I would say for if I'm spitting back that in my own words, in terms of analytics and understanding performance, let's work off of a cost target and funding gap in 22, because then we can benchmark that to actual tax data and performance data in 2022, or whatever the most recent year is that we can get information from. Okay, I think that makes a lot of sense. And then, right, the discussion and some of the discussion will some of the discussion will really be about, well, what does it really mean in, whether it's 2026 or 2030 when the plan starts, but we can extrapolate from that understanding, both on the cost and target funding gap side, as well as the tax policy side. that sound okay? A good restatement. Great. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, on number 3 of Medicare and Medicaid not being transferable, that is so disruptive that I'm not sure that we have a backup plan for that. I mean, others might, but there's the idea of, well, if Medicare and Medicaid funds are not transferable, then we pick them up, go ahead and pick them up as part of the Oregon Health Plan. That's completely, we can't fund that. I mean, because that's another 20 billion we need to come up with, in my opinion. The other thing is to say that our single payer, I mean, our Oregon Health Plan, I'm sorry, the Universal Health Plan exists side by side with Medicare and Medicaid, and they're still paid for by the feds. That's possible, but you lose so much administrative efficiency. I'd be interested in the rest of the committee of whether we want to come up with a contingency plan there. I'm thinking that if we don't get the waivers, that we need to put it off until we get the waivers. But that's my opinion, and I'm subject to change if I see more evidence. Thank you.
Okay. Charlie, did you have a response to that question?
Yeah, I essentially agree with Richard. I mean, I think there might be things that can be done, but they wouldn't be what anybody would reasonably call a universal health plan in Oregon. You know, so we can think of possibilities, but I don't really think we should be going forward. I mean, one of the biggest reasons I say that is equity, that right now Medicare and Medicaid pays less to providers in general than commercial insurance. And it wouldn't be very useful to go ahead and say, okay, well, we're going to continue that inequity and just work with the rest of it. I don't think that is a very reasonable thing. So I think we'd have to come up with a completely different notion of what to do, what makes sense to do if we can't get those waivers.
Jeff, I don't know if you were coming on, if you had a question. Okay. So I guess what I'm hearing here is we feel pretty comfortable with the math thus far, and we don't feel the need to have to sort of spend more analytic time. Go ahead, Charlie.
I mean, I think there's a pretty big question related to capital expenditures, so structures and equipment expenditures. It's really unclear to me how National Health Expenditure Accounts has made those estimates, and are they really an extra cost in the system, or are they already paid for by what hospitals and other providers get? And so to me, that's still a pretty big question. And I'm not quite sure how we go about trying to get that answered, but I would like to work with you and Will maybe on trying to get that, because I would expect that for equity purposes, the plan is going to have to be covering a substantial portion of new equipment and structures. And I don't think it's not clear how well it's accounted for at this point. So.
Okay, no, that's a good question. We can add that to the pieces here, but maybe just to step back, I'm assuming just kind of a speak now, but generally everybody feels comfortable with I would say the approach. Great, I see nodding. If anybody has any sort of big sort of pushback, oh, we need a different approach to use the cost growth target data. I'm not hearing that. Okay, great. And then I would say we can continue to kind of refine some of these things. Oh, go ahead, Mary Lou. Oh, you're on mute.
I guess I'm back to the question. Are you also saying down on possible question number 3 on the 4% efficiency capture rate? Are we agreeing to that? Or, I mean, there's
no, I would say not I think there's a question around what is our, because I think what I'm hearing from Charlie is we want to do some refinement still on our cost target by maybe taking a look at some of these key questions, like are we looking at everything that should be part of the potential total pie? To me, then the next question is really about these assumptions around transferability. And to me, and that's kind of pop this back here, I would say from our modeling and sort of scenario development work, I think we can look at multiple ones, right? Maybe there is a sort of we'll call it our best reasonable guess of what we think the capture rate and waiver transferability might be, right, as a sort of starting point. But I think as folks have noted, maybe we want to take a look at kind of other variations, perhaps, like what if actually everything falls our way and we're only trying to raise 16 billion, right, versus if everything doesn't go our way and we're trying to raise 40 billion. Like, you're really designing different revenue packages and thinking about the equity and progressivity dimensions pretty differently. So and I think that's perfectly acceptable, because you're going to want that and be able to answer questions around variation within your report.
Thanks.
Hey, Morgan, I think, is this your last slide in this?
It
section?
is.
That's what I thought. Okay. Do you want to take a break at this point?
I would say we can close the expenditure piece here. I feel like part of this is really level set, and I think we don't need to spend more time on the meeting here. But I think we generally have good guidance and agreement here. But we'll work with others. I know Charlie's volunteered, but to dive into some of these other specific questions as we refine the cost target, and we'll bring that information back as we develop that at future meetings.
Okay, so we'll take a break now, and then if we could still come back at 10:40 to give us a full hour for the next section. That's a pretty dense area.
Great. All right.
Okay, we'll see you back at 10:40. Thanks.
Thanks.
If committee members are back, could you just quickly turn on your camera for a minute so we know who's all here, or if everyone's here? I know that was a short break, and I did say this section is dense, not to say that the other sections weren't. Okay. Just to see if we've got everybody. Yeah. Well, looks like we might be missing a couple of it. Let's go ahead and move forward, Morgan.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. So just like the expenditure piece here, you all have already covered quite a bit on the funding side and the taxation side. So I'm just trying to bring this current, and then the last part of the conversation is really where we're going to want some direction, because I think it's time to start thinking about designing revenue proposals. So let me just kind of cover this fairly quickly here. Again, I think the last bit is just making sure that we are aligned, but then I think really about trying to think and have a discussion, and for us to get some direction from you to start designing revenue packages that fit the context around the funding gap, or funding gaps as we might think about them, as well as your principles around finance for a sound and just financial plan. So again, so the building blocks of the work thus far, there have been past studies at this. We need to consider the constitutional and statutory tax authority of the state, and then recognize that much of what we are trying to do here sits within some model of fiscal federalism, just meaning basically we've got different players with different governance structures and rules at the federal, state, and potentially even local level. And so here, right, we've got existing funding coming from the feds, from the state, as well as a vast majority of from private sources. There have been past efforts to look at this fairly substantively, starting with the RAND study in 2017. Here, their recommendation was to create new personal income tax brackets up from the existing one, as well as creating an employer payroll tax, and then requiring some pass-back requirements. The 2022 task force built on this and actually ran additional scenarios looking at combining federal funds, payroll taxes, and income tax. That recommendation, right, was to create a public trust fund, to create an employer payroll tax with progressive rates, as well as additional personal income taxes above the 200% of the federal poverty level, but also emphasize for additional economic and distributional analysis to avoid any unintended consequences. You've also received this last year a briefing from the Legislative Policy and Research Office. Here, right, was not necessarily to model any specific proposal, but to bring you current with the current context around personal income tax, payroll taxes, and other taxes that you may want to be considering as part of a revenue proposal. Go ahead, Charlie.
I think it's the Legislative Revenue Office, not the Legislative Policy and Research Office. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, thank you.
We got some help from the Legislative Policy and Research Office, but not on this.
Yeah. Go ahead, Cheryl.
I have a quick question on state revenue sources. Are you going to include, or are we going to include beer and wine tax or marijuana tax? I noticed the cigarette tax. Just curious about that.
I would say that is going to be up to your direction around how you want to think about the composition of any revenue tools. Right now, the past studies of this have been looking at pretty broad taxes, so taxes that are already in place, and or the ability to design sort of progressivity in them. But you can also look at other, we call them kind of more the sin taxes, right, where you're trying to, I think in the economic term, use Pigovian sort of reasoning, basically to tax it to reduce consumption, both as a revenue tool, but also as a sort of behavioral sort of health mechanism as well. But I would say these are the questions I think we're looking for direction from you as we sort of think about different ways to approach the design of a revenue package.
Yeah, of course, there currently are restrictions on the use of marijuana tax revenue and to some extent beer and wine revenue as well. So we need to look at that.
Yeah, so I think that's a great segue into the next piece here, is recognizing that all these, whatever proposal, will have to have some discussion around the legality, or the in terms of whether the tax is currently enabled, what it would take to sort of put it in place, if there are sort of substantive changes to either the rate and or eligible expenses, right? And so it's worth reflecting quickly that under Oregon state law, right, there are sort of constitutional restraints in terms of revenue bills that sort of must originate in the House and require a supermajority at the House and at the Senate level. Go ahead, Charlie.
So I've got a question on these. So do you know if a bill is passed by the legislature to be put on the ballot, a measure to be put on the ballot, does it also require the same 3/5 majority if it has a tax increase, but it's not going to be passed directly by the legislature, but instead put on the ballot?
That's a very good question. That's something I don't believe so, right? Actually, I want to answer that question. We'll follow up on that question, Charlie.
Thank you.
It doesn't for the city.
I don't know off the top of my head. Oh, you know, Will?
It doesn't for the city, for what it's worth. That's for sure. For the Portland.
No, okay. But at a state level, I imagine I don't know what the rules are on sort of revenue laws that I'm guessing through the initiative process, and whether or not they require some ratification at the state level. So let's track that down. We do want to obviously flag the kicker law question, because all past proposals have come up against us in some respect to the personal income tax, and we flag this as our cross-cutting issue, but we'll also look to get guidance on this. I think as Mimi will be engaging the Department of Justice there. We do want to make sure we also we understand the sort of tax versus fee distinction, where taxes are more compulsory and sort of used to support general revenue and are subject to the constitutional rules, whereas fees that are charged for specific services can be passed with a simple majority. But then again, the legal classification really depends on function, not necessarily just name. And so we got the think about that if you're designing programs that also look at or sort of proposals that also consider fees, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. You spent a little time, just don't want to spend too much time, but looking at sort of comparative models in other places like Canada, United Kingdom, as well as sort of the programs more at a state level in terms of Vermont and New York. And then the last piece here, I want to make sure that you just quickly cover, right? You've discussed this issue around fiscal federalism. They administer Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, and other subsidies through the ACA. Big chunk of funding in the current system is federal, and particularly distributionally for low-income populations and older adults. And so redirecting these funds is going to require some legal and administrative process to seek the appropriate waivers, as well as any sort of federal and state agreements. So we've recognized that as a key point. Why is it not advancing? Oh, there we go. At the state level, oh, sorry, go ahead, Charlie.
So going back to the last point in the last slide, another option for Medicare that the task force looked into, and I think we need to keep out as a possibility, is for the state to become a Medicare Advantage insurer. So,
Yep.
so that's another thing that's not quite directly said there. We want to make sure is part of it.
Yeah, no, it's great because I think there is going to be some tension between the opportunity to align the state tax authority with the federal funding streams there. Okay, at the state level, right, taxing authority over income, payroll taxes, provider taxes, and manages the key programs like state Medicaid and the Oregon Health Plan. They are going to the state's responsible for designing and administrating new state-based financing or taxing systems, and we'll have to pay attention to the key constitutional constraints through the kicker law, supermajority requirements, as well as the ERISA limitations. Go ahead, Charlie.
And one other important limitation is that Social Security is not taxable at the state level.
Yep. Correct. Okay. So just to summarize, I would say our approach, right, is that we're trying to blend Oregon state level taxing authority with the federal healthcare funding streams to create a comprehensive, stable, and equitable universal system. We have to find a way to transition the current employer-sponsored insurance system and payments to a public financing system without losing that federal share or creating sort of significant disruption for users. So from a design perspective, maximize federal participation and retention of those dollars. Let's leverage the Oregon authority to raise revenues that are equitable, legally sound, and politically feasible. And then we're going to have to sort of consider sort of phased and sort of specific implementation strategies that account for administrative legal barriers. So whether that's ERISA, as well as questions that have been raised around reserves, as well as funding for unique sort of parts of the plan implementation. All right, so now I'm going to flip into, I think that's the work thus far. The governing board has asked the Finance and Revenue Committee to also consider cost sharing. And I think some important context before we get into that conversation. The Joint Task Force, right, was very clear that the plan should not require payment at the point of service, no copays, deductibles, coinsurance. Aligns with the Senate bill that created it, as well as key principles in designing the plan. They did sort of consider premiums for high income individuals as a sort of alternative to the income tax, but that proposal was rejected because of the challenges around optimizing efficiency and reducing administrative costs. Go ahead, Charlie.
I would say that we could still consider something that's sort of akin to premium, but actually collected as essentially as an income tax, which is part of what my modeling spreadsheet for possible tax structures did. So
Yep.
that there's so that it's essentially just another portion of the income tax, but it's kind of like a premium. So.
Yeah. And so I'll cut this short here. Given the sort of the context here, from Senate Bill 1089, right? That 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 instructs the governing board to consider recommendations from the joint task force. It does not directly mandate that cost sharing or the elimination thereof be considered. And so some discussion at the last week's governing board suggested that there's really no expectation that the Finance and Revenue Committee primarily model or recommend a cost sharing as part of its recommendations. But it thought it instructive that this committee spend some time contemplating and evaluating cost sharing options as part of your modeling work, as a sort of due diligence and comprehensive assessment of how that may work, and either through, I think, what, as Charlie has suggested, or through other more direct forms, right? Because one could make the case of like, why should we consider it? There are sort of good reasons to be considering it in terms of avoiding the kicker, simpler approval, some public familiarity, the advantages from a legal ariser perspective, the ability to design both flexible and progressive systems, and also sort of mirroring kind of current systems. That's kind of called the base case scenario here. So what specifically I think the board would like to understand is basically, can we design or evaluate different progressive cost sharing structures based on some ability to pay, making sure that we consider how those fees may compare to income, the more progressive income tax, or with respect to public accessibility, equity, and stability. Are there lessons learned that we can be drawn from kind of Medicare Part B and D and premiums and other sort of comparable systems? And could we sort of cap or provide sliding scales to preserve affordability while still generating revenue? Before Charlie, we get to your question, Mimi or Cheryl, anything else you want to add from that conversation that might help just provide a little more context?
You covered it well from my perspective.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead, Charlie.
Right.
So is this something we're going to discuss later, or something we should be talking a little bit about now, or?
I would say why don't you hold it, because I think we're going to be talking about it in totality of the entire sort of revenue package. But I think I'm mostly just here providing sort of the relaying the word here that there's some desire to think of, given the size and uncertainty of the funding gap, to make sure that the Finance and Revenue Committee's work is comprehensive of all potential funding sources as it thinks about sort of the distribution, the adequacy, volatility, and distributional impacts of funding that gap. Go ahead, Mary Lou.
Well, as a member of the board,
Yep.
This issue came up at the last meeting with relatively no planning or discussion ahead of time. I think I was very much opposed. And I understand the issues. I understand what we're talking about here, but I felt like there really had been a commitment to that there was not going to be cost sharing, and that to waste a whole bunch of time from your work, et cetera, but it was kind of put forward, well, they could do this scenario and that scenario and whatever. And I would have to go back and listen to the discussion, but I know when I left the meeting, I kind of went, well, no, we're not doing that. So whether Mimi, if you have, or Cheryl, you were there at the meeting, am I totally off base here?
I would go back just before they jump in. I would say I would highlight this last thing is that I think I was channeling you, Mary Lou, in that there's no expectation that the preferred alternative would have a cost sharing component to it. What I was channeling then from the other conversation is it might not be bad from an analytic point of view when the recommendations come up and somebody asks, well, why did you guys look at potential cost sharing? That at least there's an answer, and you say from a recommendation, like, yes, we recommend a no cost sharing system or approach, but we evaluated this and this is why we're not doing it. So I think of it sort of the null sort of counterfactual that has been answered, so that you have redress for any of those potential questions.
I guess I could go along with that. I just guess since I have no idea about all of the work that you've been contracted to do, how much we're paying you, what all those pieces are, I just wouldn't want a whole bunch of time that could be on other pieces neglected because you're saying, oh, we have to do these kind of things. So
We
that's
have a lot to do, and it's always a challenge to make it work. But I think we're in service of kind of your charge and the questions that you have is kind of our final litmus.
okay. So Cheryl or
Yeah.
okay.
Jeff and then Cheryl.
I'll defer to Cheryl, and then I'll go afterwards.
I'm sure you have something important to say, Jeff, but I was just going to briefly comment that I wasn't part of that discussion at last board meeting, Mary Lou. I think I left and you came in, so we weren't at the same parts of the board meeting. But I am all for just looking at all the possibilities, and I think that's where we're going to today. We don't need to spend a ton of time on it if the committee is just a hard no, but I do think it's good to see to explore all the possibilities that we have in front of us. So I'm fine with that.
Go ahead, Jeff.
In the interest of trying to keep this question simple, number one, we have a decent idea of what the total cost of the program would be. Number two, if we just simply say for each, and number two is we also know there is a significant, regardless of which scenario, as we're calling it, a funding gap. So why not just simply say if there's a 2% cost sharing across the board, for regardless of the procedures, regardless of the period, a 2% cost sharing across the board generates approximately this much revenue, and leave it at that.
Yep. That is definitely one way we can handle that. So I don't want to lose your point there, Jeff, because I think I want to get us to what I think. I don't want to belabor these points. You guys know this, but I would say, where are we now, right? So we have a good basis of the expenditures. We have a good understanding of our cost target and funding gap. We have some basis of past attempts to look at this. And so how do we then start moving forward to actually design potential approaches here? And so this is a proposal, mostly as a way to start conversation. But what we need as staff to you here is some direction around how do we construct different ways to think about addressing that funding gap, given your principles for designing the system. So I think about this as basically some different ways to think about the problem. And so one, I'll call this kind of what I'm calling reference band or a composite scenario, right? We could start with past efforts and say, okay, well, let's look at the RAND proposal. Let's look at the Joint Task Force proposal, or some base understanding of what the work that's been done. I know Charlie's taken a crack at some of this already, and we could just say, like, we'll call this our reference one, like a realistic view of what a package might be. Kind of if we had to, place our cards on the table today and say, like, this is, if you press me today, this is how I might think about it. The great side of that is basically it's pretty accessible. It's fairly straightforward. But from an analytic perspective, it can become a little harder to disentangle the effects of kind of each different component, perhaps. A different way to think about the alternatives is really to bookend them, right? To create some sort of, 2 to 3 really radically different kind of funding approaches, right? What if we did it all payroll? What if we did it all progressive? I think here, Jeff's question, what if we just did kind of a sort of, well, what would just be a 2% cost share look like, perhaps, or an all income tax model? These are great ways to think about it because they kind of directly sort of express the values and principles of the community. And they're useful for kind of testing kind of resilience across different kinds of political or economic shocks, so we can kind of actually see how they perform independent of each other. Another way to think about it would be kind of a minimum disruption approach, right? So think about it as sort of designing a system that doesn't look too different from the systems today. One could think about sort of maintaining employer payments, and having some cost sharing. But here it really helps kind of frame sort of like how do we transition our current situation to a future situation. And then the last way I want you to kind of maybe potentially think about this is through cluster-based testing. And so here we're really trying to take your principles and express them and operationalize them. So you can think of it as basically, well, what would be potentially the most progressive way we could do this, right? Could it be an income tax with some type of stratified cost sharing arrangement that you've looked at in the past? What would be a sort of more employment-based cluster where we're looking at some combination of either payroll or employer mandates? What if we, I think as Cheryl said, looked at something more consumption-based through either some combination of fees, provider taxes, or specific sales taxes and other types of arrangements? Here it helps us kind of think about sort of how you might want to package these things that align around either your value or political constituencies. So I'm not proposing that you do any of these pieces, but I would like some conversation from everybody here to give us some guidance and initial thoughts around when you think about sort of testing this, both for your own understanding and documentation, how you might approach this. Go ahead, Charlie, and then Richard.
I mean, so I would like to do it more along the way of that I had proposed earlier, and that is looking at what is the nature of the tax structure that we want to create. And so I can sort of say quite a bit about that right now, what my ideas are, but among those things is why would you have a payroll tax? And I can answer that question pretty quickly with the reason why you would. I mean, there's lots of reasons why you wouldn't want to have it, but there's a good reason why you might. And also, if you do, in my mind, to go along with our fairness principles, you basically have to have that as a tax credit on an income tax. So anyway, I think that there's another way to go about it, which is more about, well, what's the nature of our tax structure? And we can talk a little bit about, and I think in my mind, fairly quickly dismiss the notion of fees at the time of service. So
yeah, let's come back to some of the deeper thoughts, but I want to get other folks preliminary thinking a little bit about approach as opposed to the specifics first. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I'm strongly in favor of option one versus the other three options. I like the blended model. Charlie's already gotten to work on that blended model. You can keep that blended model that Charlie's worked on and bring in other revenue sources that just lower the need from Charlie's blended model. So I think strongly prefer that. The other thing, I want to make sure that that you as consultants bring in the sales tax. Not saying we're doing it, but it has to be considered. And here's why I think it has to be considered. I know it's horribly unpopular. It's been voted down 8 or 9 times in Oregon, but Oregon is one of 5 states without it. And we're also those for high income earners in Portland, we're only the highest taxed high earners in the country, except for New York City. And to not consider a sales tax, I think is madness. To consider it. The other thing is, if you look at Jessica Riedel from the Manhattan Institute, the biggest difference between the way we tax in the United States versus the rest of the Oregon OECD is that we don't have a sales tax or a value-added tax. The rest of the developed world has a roughly 10% value-added tax, which we don't have in this country, and we certainly don't have in Oregon. And to rely only on payroll and income tax, I think is a mistake. And when people see those numbers, they're going to get out their consultants, not you, of course, but they're going to get out people to sway it away from taxing high earners. So I just think we need to present it as an alternative. If I had to look at having co-pays versus having a sales tax, I'd much prefer have a system of sales tax and not have co-pays. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. Go ahead, Cheryl.
I agree with Richard on all those points. I think we've got to look at a sales tax. I'm really interested in the value added tax too. And on the options, the only one that I have real aversion to is option 2 for those reasons that I think we need to look at these other taxes.
Mary Lou? And I want to hear from Jeff as well.
I'm with Charlie and Richard also. I don't want any kind of payment at point of service. I'm still having a little trouble with the kind of what the premium idea, but I'd like to see that first model especially. And I do think, despite being a lifetime Oregonian and having lived through all of those voting sales tax down, and that it's regressive and all kinds of reasons I don't like it, but maybe it could be structured in a way that is less regressive. And if it was, seen that this was to get us to a whole new transformed health system, maybe it would have a chance versus just in general, let's have a sales tax.
Thank you, Mary Lou. Jeff.
Thank you. I think we have to look at all the options on the table, which includes the potential for fees. We may not like it, but we've got to have a scale of the dollars for each of the options, and it's going to be a composite recommendation no matter what we do. We're not going to be able to do this based on just income tax or just payroll tax. So taking anything off the table at this point is premature.
Okay. So just and Cheryl, am I missing? Oh, go ahead, Cheryl.
I was just going to ask Bethany if she'd like to share any preferences. She's our other committee member.
Yeah, I was going to ask if I'm missing anybody.
Thanks, Cheryl. You read my mind. I was just sort of waiting. I agree with pretty much what everyone else said. I think we really need to look at sales tax, and it can't just be on income. That's all I was going to say.
Go ahead, Charlie.
I mean, so what I'm proposing is actually really not quite a blended thing, because it's, again, I go back, we got to look at the nature of the tax structure. The 60% payroll, 30% income tax, that still doesn't get at the, well, how are they related to each other? So I think we need to make sure we're looking at that. So I wouldn't really say what I would like is the a blended thing, a combination of past proposals. It's actually pretty different than any past proposal. So
yeah, no,
what I would like.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I think what I'm hearing here is and the reason I kind of put these different options are a different way of just understanding interaction and tax structure questions, and so and Charlie, I'm kind of curious for some additional thinking there is not necessarily what I'm hearing is basically folks want to express some of the principles we have, and then think about various tax tools that might perform a little differently, right? So one can think of is like, you could still say like, well, maybe I still want an all personal income tax sort of structure, or maybe we could sort of, think of sort of, well, we also want to make sure that we have broad-based taxes. And so with low rates, so what might be a way to kind of put together a composite scenario that does something like that. Or that also includes cost sharing at some level. But I think I'm hearing kind of some ideas that say like we don't want to just look at just one of these things or a progressive structure. You really want to kind of maybe look at sort of different ways to solve the funding gap through different combinations of tools, perhaps. I think that's what I'm hearing. But go ahead, Cheryl, then Charlie.
I forgot to mention that I believe John Santa's on the phone too. I don't know if he can get off mute and can speak up, but just want to.
I don't think he's on any longer.
Oh,
Shelley.
is he not? Okay.
No,
All
I've
right.
been calling his phone number. It's not there anymore.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, go ahead, Charlie.
Are we ready to talk about some specifics, or?
I'll let Richard go. Richard, do you have any other?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Charlie about the issue of blended. What I meant by blended was that there are several sources of revenue for this model, and I thought your spreadsheet offered a couple with the ability to beautifully dial them in there. That's what I meant by blended. But I'd like you to elaborate, if you would, please, about why that's the wrong word to use, and I'm happy to change it.
Well, so the first point on there, use an initial combination of revenue sources based on past proposals. And it's like, well, no, not really. It's completely different. I mean, it used the same sources, sort of, but not really. And I guess the biggest point there is that the the double taxation point, I guess, the
Okay, yeah, no, I
payroll
got that.
tax and the income tax point. That's what I object really strongly to that
No,
double
got it.
taxation piece. Okay,
That's one of our,
otherwise, fine, yeah.
that's one of our principles, isn't it? On,
It is, yes,
Yeah.
yeah. So to me, that's just like, okay, let's base it on principles.
got it, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and maybe that's a great way to sort of rephrase this option one. What do you mean call it option? Like, our own option is to really base it on our principles. But what I'm hearing is that we want to look at sort of combinations of things that express those principles as best we can. So, and
So are we ready for details?
Yeah, go for it, Charlie. Yep.
Okay. So I want to go back to the cost sharing thing. So I would expect that if you look into it very carefully, the excess cost to raise revenue with cost sharing at time of service, especially if it is based on income, it's going to be pretty expensive to do that. And the only way you're going to raise enough revenue to make that reasonable is to have really pretty high fees, because it's going to be a really expensive process to say, well, how much should this particular individual pay? And each office is going to have to do that billing. And that's a really complicated mess that we're trying to get rid of. And so to me, that is I would say we really don't want to do that. And if we look into it at all, I would say you've got to be really careful looking into how much is that going to cost, or how much savings are you going to miss? It's actually not a new cost. It's like, okay, we're eliminating almost all of the possible savings we have in provider offices by requiring them to do that. So it's a huge cost. And I cannot imagine you're going to raise enough revenue to make it worthwhile. And you're going to actually discourage needed care as much as you're going to discourage unneeded care. I mean, most studies that look into it say, yeah, you discourage unneeded care just as much. And so we're also going to lose the savings of people getting the appropriate care that they need. So I think we really want to avoid that. And I also agree that why look into this again? We've looked at it a lot. And every time we've looked into it, we said, no, we don't want to do that. And so to me, it's a pretty big waste of time as well. There's so many reasons to not have that in my mind.
Go ahead, Mimi.
Thanks. And apologies for being off video and having some bandwidth. I'm just wondering if you all, when you're speaking about fees and things, if you don't mind clarifying, there's a big difference between point of service fees versus what we call premium. So sort of like monthly fees. When you're saying absolutely not, we've looked at that, we don't want, point of service fees, or even so thank you. Just to clarify.
Point of service fee.
Right. Absolutely not.
Okay, so what, from a process perspective, do you have guidance for us about how you might want to start packaging up? I would say we'd be nice to do 2, 3, maybe 4 distinct ideas or explorations into expressing the sort of principles in your piece. But I think if people have strong priors on how you might want to approach that, I'm curious from a process development perspective, how do you want us to kind of go about doing this? Charlie.
So I want to go back to the payroll tax. The only reason for payroll tax, in my mind, well, there's actually, I shouldn't say the only, there's several reasons for a payroll tax. The most important reason for payroll tax is that right now there's a federal tax exclusion on money that is paid for an employer insurance, employer provided insurance. So in order to preserve that and not have lots more taxes just going out of Oregon into the federal government and not ever coming back, that's a good reason to have a payroll tax. Another reason that you might want a payroll tax is sort of stability. Currently, a lot of employers do in fact pay a payroll tax, and trying to get them to continue to provide that that source of revenue, a payroll tax could be useful for that. Another another way that that money could come into the system is to just then pay higher salaries if they don't have to do that. But not all companies will do that, and that will create the problem of all sorts of tax money going out of federal tax money going out of the state. So there's a good reason for the payroll tax, but there's also a good reason to not do it, and that is to try to get away from the tying employment to health care. So, I mean, to me, there's conflicting reasons there, but I still think overall that having a payroll tax that raises roughly as much money as, well, actually a combination of payroll tax, corporate income tax, and perhaps another increased, I forget what the name of the tax is, total tax on business income.
Income tax.
Yeah, so I think that total, having that be roughly about what employers currently pay for employer health care is a useful target. And I think and that's part of what I try to do in my spreadsheet that allows people to play with it. So that's the reasons for having that number in there, is I think it's useful to try to keep those about the same if you can. So I'll stop there.
All right. No, thank you, Charlie. Go ahead, Mary Lou.
This is a question for Charlie. When we had a discussion with Joe Jarvis from Utah a couple of weeks ago, and they're moving forward. And what is the name of the tax that they have, Charlie, that he's proposing there?
I think Morgan just mentioned it. What was it again?
Corporate income tax.
Corporate activity tax is what it's called in Oregon.
Corporate
So yeah,
activity. Okay.
Yeah.
And that we have, I was like totally unaware that we had such a thing, and that, we have a relatively small one. And what at least was said that night was that ours is going for education. And, we aren't going to want to take on the education folks and have a fight between healthcare and education. But Washington State has a much higher one, but they don't have an income tax. So I don't know whether that's even, whether it's not mentioned here on any of these kinds of things, but I'm wondering if it could
well,
be.
it is in my spreadsheet, and I think we should mention, I think we should look into it. I think that's one of the things I would like Echo Northwest to look into, is that corporate activity tax. And I guess one of the first questions is related to what you just mentioned, Mary Lou, and that is right now it goes to education. Is that by law that it's dedicated? Is it in the Constitution that it's dedicated to education? I completely agree. We don't want to go after any part that's there for education now, but if we increased it, can we say the increased portion can go to the healthcare fund?
Right.
In my mind, that's something we should definitely be looking at.
Thank you.
I don't think we want to raise very much money that way, though, because I think there's lots of reasons why it should be low. And I think it would be a mistake to raise very much, but I think we could raise on the order of $500 million or maybe even $1 billion that way, but not much more than that, probably.
Okay.
Richard.
Morgan, you talked about next steps. I think one way forward would be to start with something akin to Charlie's spreadsheet that has 4 or 5 of these sources in there, and kind of look at each aspect of the spreadsheet, not focusing on the spreadsheet, but focusing on the corporate activity tax, the premium fee, the individual income tax, and the payroll tax, and just looking at that, moving the dial on how much or how little it produces, and go through each of those 4 funding mechanisms and get questions and discussion from this group, so that we all come up to the same level and are able to discuss it effectively. And then probably at some point add a sales tax, not because we're going to have a sales tax, but to show how it could affect the overall requirements. So, but anyway, the idea of going through each of those areas and talking about them and getting questions, and maybe have some pre-reading on what each of those would be, so that we all come up to the same level of understanding. Over.
Yeah, no, I'm hearing that might make sense. I mean, my preference here would be to kind of start with kind of like the tax structure, right? Like what's enabled today, how easy or hard is it to kind of actually create capacity, and then how does it perform relative to your principles? And then to suggest things that aren't here today, right? What is how would those sit with respect to the existing tax structure? And then again, how do they perform relative to the things that you guys have cared about in the past? So, and in some combination of those things, we should be able to derive kind of, we'll call it something, a package, right? Ultimately to sort of test, or variations of a package to test. Go ahead, Charlie.
I mean, so all of the taxes that are in my spreadsheet are existing taxes. There
Yep.
wouldn't need to be a new mechanism to raise money for any of them. And that's why I put them in there. So there's another basic question related to the income tax is, our principles say it should be progressive, but another principle, and something that was brought up by Richard earlier, is that if the income tax rate on high earners is too high, they're likely going to be moving out of Oregon, or at least legally being able to say, we're not in Oregon, we're not paying that tax. And so there's a question in my mind that we want to be thinking about is, do we want to have a cap on income that's subject to taxes? Do we want to have something like what I put in my spreadsheet is a soft cap, where the tax rate isn't as at some level of income, which you can choose in the spreadsheet, the tax rate is no longer the same marginal rate, but actually goes down a little bit rather than up. That's essentially a soft cap, so that as you make more money, you're always paying more in taxes, but not as much. Now, so that goes against the principle of equity, or of progressiveness anyway, but it also helps with the fact of high income people leaving Oregon, which if we actually put in the kind of taxes that we might necessarily need to put in, and the rate stays the same for all income, there's going to be a huge incentive to leave Oregon for high income people. So anyway, that's a fundamental question we need to think about, and that's something you can play with in the spreadsheet. If you can look at, well, what's the effect on that. Another basic question in my mind that we need to think about very much up front is, if we do have a payroll tax, should it be there to raise additional money, or should it just be there to get money from employers and be a tax credit on the income tax? My preference is the latter, that whatever is raised on behalf from an employer on behalf of an employee is a credit on their income tax, so you don't double tax that money. To me, that's a basic principle that I would like us to have, but it isn't the way that the taxes were structured under either Rand or Optimus. So that's another question that we need to be thinking about. So I guess I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Charlie. Mary Lou?
Well, this is kind of, some people will think off the wall, but back in 2006 or something, I worked trying to decrease the consumption of sugar sweetened beverages. And we were forwarding the idea of a sugar sweetened beverage tax, and people just thought we were crazy, and was, it never went anywhere. But, it is, quote, is it a sin tax? Mexico established one, and really dropped the consumption of sugar sweetened beverage. So since we're doing health issues, and obesity is one of our biggest issues, that, I'm just kind of throwing it out there that it wouldn't raise a whole bunch of money, but it just was something I thought I had to say.
Okay. Go ahead, Charlie.
I generally agree that we should probably look at syntax a little bit, and they are not going to raise much money, but I think they're useful to have a little bit of an increase for the purpose that Mary just said. So again, it would be useful to have numbers. Well, if you raised it X percent more than what it is now, or you implemented one on sweetened beverages, how much would it raise, and what effect? And again, it's not going to be much money. It's not going to help very much in the revenue part, but it is potentially going to help in the health part.
Okay. And in selling it to the Oregonians, I think.
Yes, that too.
Okay. So I'm gonna put a pin in this, but I feel like we've got some direction here. Our plan here will probably be to work offline and maybe reach out to a few folks, Charlie specifically, because I think what we want to do is try to organize our July meeting to really understand tax structure issues and push a little more towards revenue package options. Is kind of a key priority that we want to accelerate because it's going to take us time to do a lot of the distributional analysis. And so the sooner we can at least get some preliminary understanding of what that would look like, that would be great. Go ahead, Charlie.
And one other that I sort of already asked you folks to look into is the restaurant and lodging tax. And to me, that you could raise, again, not very much money, but a little bit. And the excuse for doing that is related to the healthcare that people who are visiting Oregon are going to need. So,
Yep. Yeah. So I think there's kind of a nexus question there with respect to beneficiaries, as well as sort of an elasticity thing too. Tourists tend to be a little more not too much demand responsive sometimes on some of the taxes. Go ahead, Richard.
As we look to funding opportunities and possibilities, one thing I would add to Charlie's spreadsheet to enlarge it is the household contribution to employer-sponsored insurance. So if you look at Charlie's original cost spreadsheet for 2022 and 2023, if you take on the order of $17 billion of employer-sponsored insurance,
Yep.
$5 billion of that comes from households paying in premiums or paying on out of pocket at the time of service or after service. So that's a big, big chunk. And so when we look at this modeling about how's it going to affect, we can't forget that even though the employers pay the bulk of employer-sponsored insurance, individuals pay a lot, and that will go away and be replaced with with income tax and all. And that's a huge revenue stream and very significant. It also plays into building personas of people in different stages of life with different employment situations, and where the money under current situations you're paying this in terms of including out of pocket and premium support, but then under the new universal health plan you don't have that, but now you're paying these other fees. So it'll be great to go to those personas and say, here's how it balances out for you. Over.
Certainly. All right. Any last discussion on this or direction? Otherwise, I feel like we've got, we're going to be, oh, go ahead, Mary Lou.
It just was, I think, Richard saying that, wasn't there something in somewhere when we were talking either last meeting or somewhere in terms of your contract that you're going to be working on a cost calculator or developing one, and that it would be that kind of thing where people can see that now I'm paying this and I would pay this, but net, here I am.
Yeah, one of the things we could do once we're kind of at a proposal stage, right, is do a kind of a call it a, I don't want to say a burden comparison, right? So I think as what Richard articulated here, there's what you're spending today versus what you would spend tomorrow, and you would evaluate that on your own situation, but also put your situation in the context of some understanding of equity in terms of like, well, am I paying more if I'm a 10th percentile earner now? Am I paying more or less than in this situation relative to other payers? So
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, yet to be defined sort of task order, but I think we'll kind of get there at some point in time when the moment's right. Okay, great. I will put a pin in this, and then one more thing here. Again, mostly a level set, and we'll move quickly on this one. Oh, I guess how I say. Many windows open here for sharing. The last piece here, I just want to do a quick level set. Oops, wrong thing to share. Is just to do a quick level set on Ariza, and mostly just making sure that we're all up to speed on this, and I think we are, right? Employment Retirement Income Security Act of 74, right, provides uniform federal rules on for private retirement and employer-sponsored health insurance programs to make sure that the states don't impose conflicting regulations. Under ERISA, the states are prohibited from directly regulating or interfering with employer-sponsored health plans, especially self-insured plans, which are common among large employers. And so for our piece, right, if Oregon's new financing structure looks like it forces employers to modify or abandon their self-insured plans, it could be challenged in court and found to be preempted by ERISA. And so we have to take this risk assessment seriously. The Joint Task Force concluded that Oregon cannot require employers to alter or drop existing coverage, and employer mandates tied to insurance offerings or expenditures may be legally vulnerable. And so any payroll or employer-based tax must be structured broadly, not in a health plan specific way in order to reduce legal risk. So the big implication here is Oregon's revenue strategy has to be ERISA safe. And so mechanisms like a general payroll tax or individual contributions cannot target employer mandates. So that's kind of the key piece. And this is all based on the legal understanding that was registered as part of the Joint Task Force work. So, so for us, right, we have to design taxes on any tax specifically on an employer premium or penalty for offering or not offering coverage, right, is something that we're going to have to avoid, as well as any mandates that encourage employers to exit or modify their self-insured plans. And so broadly, 4 kind of general strategies to avoid the ERISA preemption. So general taxes that apply across sectors. So basically making sure payroll taxes aren't tied to health plan status, making sure we structure taxes as broad-based and neutral without linking them to whether an employer is offering coverage, making sure that we use triggers or any fallback mechanisms if an ERISA challenge arises. So we have to figure out if there is something that we feel might have some potential sort of preemption issue, that we have some fallback. And then we have to consider any kind of waiver approaches or safe harbor designs through that may also have some sort of risk mitigation as part of those pieces. So this is just a quick sort of recap of, I think, work that you've already done and things I think you are well aware of. The thing I want to flag as part of this is the operations committee on their meeting next week, June 26th, is discussing legal and structural issues that might intersect here with the revenue strategy, and specifically ERISA related risks and kind of legal safeguards. And what I'd like to do 2 things here is Cheryl and Mimi are making sure to extend the invitation for folks to join as members of the public to hear that presentation and discussion, but specifically we wanted to flag, are there kind of key questions that you would like the operations committee to consider as part of that presentation specifically, or are we all comfortable with kind of the current situation? So I think it's really just things we want to put on their agenda to consider next week, and then we can loop back on any feedback they have for us. Everybody feel like they on top of the ERISA issues here? And okay, great. So I would say I'm going to plan on dropping in on that meeting so I can hear that piece, and if anything comes up, I'll kind of channel back here with folks. Go ahead, Charlie.
So I do have a question related to a corporate income tax and also the corporate activity tax related to ERISA. To me, they wouldn't be implicated, but maybe, I guess I would like you to think about that a little bit to see what your
yeah, off the top of my head, those sort of general business activity taxes for me don't really touch on, because of the nature of the nexus of the tax relative to what the ERISA issue. So I wouldn't think off the top of my head, but I think we'll probably want a
Yeah.
legal opinion on that, but I think they feel pretty distinct enough in my mind.
And also, I guess that in general, the smaller you can make the corporate payroll tax, the less likely an ERISA challenge is to prevail. So,
Yeah.
so I mean, that's another general principle, but if you make it too small, then we have the other issues of losing money. So,
Yep.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, and I agree, the nexus issue is the key one. I ain't no lawyer, but I have lived through lots of discussions of ERISA impacts on financing plans. And it's that issue of sort of how closely related to employer behavior is your tax, and in particular, are you trying to create some sort of behavioral change or compulsion at its most extreme on the employer? And Charlie, you're right, it's pronounced ERISA, just so the Echo Northwest people don't that in any other public setting. It's
Let
ERISA.
me just apologize for all the other mispronunciations that are going to be coming your way. So.
Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you, everyone. So that's the our pieces, and Cheryl, I'll turn it back to you. I know we're going to talk a little bit about the meeting plan here in a little bit, but we can do that.
We are so on time. I can't believe it. It's remarkable. So in terms of meeting reflections, I'm not going to attempt to summarize what we all discussed today. I took a lot of notes, I'm sure others did too. I would be curious to circle back, whether that's next meeting or some other meeting, on what your takeaways, Morgan, and others are on the admin costs presentation. Because what I heard Anya say is that the literature review gives us background and gives and that we are to give you as contractors parameters for estimating savings. So I'd be curious to just hear your thoughts about that at a future meeting. And then what I got from next steps was that at our next meeting on July 1st, we discuss the tax structure ideas or issues, and then start on the revenue package. Is that what you took away, Morgan? And do you have enough to get us there in 2 weeks? So that's my question for you.
Yeah. So when we were thinking about the sort of work plan schedule moving forward, we collapsed basically, at least initially, kind of 3 meetings into one. So we were able to cover the expenditure, cost target, funding gap, some discussion, a little bit of the tax structure pieces, as well as scenarios, and as well as sort of just recapping the ERISA stuff. So we thank you very much for all that feedback of the ground you've covered and consolidating that. So next meeting, I think there are 3 to 4 things we're in my mind that we'll want to talk about. The first one, I think, is, and obviously this is a quick turnaround, is to organize the tax structure work and do some seed, I would call them, sort of plant some seeds on potential sort of revenue packages that I would say are in line with your principles. So what I think myself, Will, and Andrew will be do some thinking to, probably maybe reach out to Charlie. I mean, thank you for all the great work he's done there, and just make sure we understand, not being duplicative of stuff that's already been done, but at least sort of arrange it in a way that I think will be portable to you to say, like, yeah, let's put a little bit of A with B and C, and we feel like that's broadly going to meet our adequacy, progressivity kind of concerns. But we also might want to think about some other options and just try to start putting together kind of, 3 to 4 ideas around revenue packages. And I think the hope would be in meeting 3 that we could kind of have that sort of structured kind of comparison, and then actually start identifying, those kind of composite revenue packages that we can start testing more in depth. They don't have to be necessarily finalized, but I think as long as we can get to some agreement, that would be great. The other piece here that we might try to slide into that meeting will be dependent on Milliman contract status. It'd be great to get them in front of you all to talk about their work, and so we can understand in more detail how their work is going to interface with the things that we're doing here.
So
And-
tentatively, we'll hear also from Milliman on July 1st if everything's set in their
So
contract.
look,
Right, maybe? Do you think that's doable?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you repeat that, Cheryl?
To have Milliman join us and talk about their scope of work for this committee on July
I'm not sure if
1st.
they're going to be able to join us, but I think we might at least have a sense of the
Oh, okay.
a little bit more updated scope of
Little
work.
bit, okay. And so I know we're going to go into just an outline of the meetings moving forward, and I'd really like to hear committee feedback on that. But first, if there are other questions or comments, Charlie, go ahead.
Just going to say the admin savings piece is uncertain enough that we still have about as much uncertainty as we did before. So unfortunately, I think Anya did a good job, and it is that uncertain. We don't know. So that's going to be a tough one to move forward. I would like to encourage people on the committee to play with that tax structure spreadsheet that I put out if you can, because I think it'll give you a little bit of an idea of what some of the questions that can come up when you're doing so. And if you have any questions on how to play with it, please contact me. You can get a hold of me, and I can help you with how you might play with it and what you can do with it. But I think that can help people at least explore some of the options that we're talking about. And I think the rest of the options that we're talking about, other than perhaps a sales tax or a value added tax, are going to be relatively small numbers. So they're not going to change things a lot. Anyway, I encourage that because I think that's going to help people.
Thanks, Charlie. I really appreciate that. And just a reminder to everybody, if you have comments or questions on anything we've discussed today, be sure to send those to Mimi. Email them to her. Richard?
Feedback on today's meeting, Echo Northwest, huge kudos the way you ran the meeting today. There was a lot of preparatory material, but you assumed correctly that committee members would read it all and study it and come to this meeting prepared. And then you went through the slides quickly, which was perfect. You just touched the high points, sometimes 30 seconds a slide, but it allowed us to put up our hand and say, hey, can you explain that? Or a little elaborate on this and that. And you see how much discussion was, a rich, rich discussion, because you allowed us time to do that instead of going through the slides like it's the first time we see it. I really appreciate you treated it that way. I'd love that in the future. And look at the progress we made between the end of last meeting and where we are today. Huge. And kudos to you, Echo Northwest, for doing that so well.
Thank you very much for the feedback, and I think we're trying to make it as productive as possible. So, but thanks for all the help you guys are giving us.
Yeah, and I echo Richard's thanks and praise and appreciate you, Morgan and Will, so much.
Yep.
Will, go ahead.
Sorry, this is a clarifying question, just real quick. Maybe it's better offline. But Richard, you mentioned a scholar at the Manhattan Institute around the VAT tax. Was that Oregon specific?
No.
Okay, yeah.
Jessica Riedel, Manhattan Institute, has written on the taxing structure.
Okay.
And the deficit. I won't take the rest of the time, but the
Yeah,
big thing there is that you look out 30 years, we're talking a deficit of a debt of $375 trillion. And the bulk of that, 75% of that, is Medicare, Social Security, and income support. So what we're doing here is all about Medicare, or involves Medicare, but he also looks at the tax structure of the rest of the world. Her name used to be Brian Riedel. She transitioned as Jessica Riedel, and she has a 136 slide deck that goes through all the numbers and then shows where our taxing structure is way different from the rest of the world. And it's not as different as you think. We're the most progressive taxing country in the world, which is unusual. And the big difference is the value-added tax, which most other countries have. So the middle class in this country is not paying their fair share, according to her research. Okay, big deal. But anyway,
no, this is awesome. Yeah, I used to have some slides at the University of Oregon that I gave my students about taxation in international perspective. That's for another. Thank you very much.
Okay, with that, we'd like to look at our meeting schedule and see if we have any quick feedback.
Should I pull that up here?
Mhm.
So just doing some future lookout past our July meeting here. Let me make this bigger, sorry. I have a giant monitor, so this is one of those I have problems seeing too. So and this is sort of just for your review and sort of feedback. So meeting 3, right? We have a short turnaround, and so we're really trying to queue up the tax structure work and revenue package pieces. Meeting 4, I think it's worth. We're going to try to start getting some thinking in on startup costs, reserves, and implementation planning. So trying to map those conversations out so we can understand, potential reserve size, launch costs, other kind of capital pieces that we need to be thinking about. How do we actually make a little bit of the phase transition, and understanding that process, and then to reflect on any kind of legal or operational or implementation pieces. That's a broad sort of category of things, but it feels like given our work task study, that meeting 4 it would be useful because it's something we can dive into now and do some thinking and mapping, and then gives us some time then for meeting 5. So coming out of meeting 3, the hope is to have some potential, at least identification of some packages, so we can then start doing our household and employer impact analysis. So this is the distributional impact to understand kind of whether or not we have the intended or unintended consequences with the things we care about with respect to the revenue side, the ability to pay side, but then more broadly on the economic and efficiency and employment side. Out of that, I think Charlie and others have already discuss ways to think about sort of soft caps, phase-ins, tax credits, or other kinds of exemptions to deal with any kind of things you would like to mitigate based on that piece. So part of that presentation of those impacts will kind of then have a conversation around, are there areas here that we feel like, based on the implications of what we proposed, we want to make some remedy for. And then we'll carry forward some of the conversation around the startup and reserve planning as well. Between meeting 5, I'm guessing many things to iterate on. And so we'll be coming back on some updated revenue modeling and the transition work in our October meeting. We'll be developing the report side by side. So meeting 7, I think, is the first time we'll want to spend a lot of time talking about recommendations based on that piece. I think this will be kind of a thread we'll be starting to pull forward from meeting 5 and 6, but specifically taking a lot of the work and putting it into a recommendation framework that we'll see spelled out in your draft, and then spend some time talking about final decision criteria, talking about trade-offs and any other kind of feedback. Meeting 8, right, is reserved for final approval, last minute changes, and then submission of the final report to the governing board there. Again, a lot of work. And I know, Cheryl, you've raised questions around the monthly meeting cadence and the additional need for potentially meeting supplementary to that. I will leave that as kind of an open question that I think we probably will have a good sense on as we kind of hit meetings 3 and 4 to consider. But Cheryl, I'll leave it to you to kind of facilitate any other questions off of that.
Yeah, we had informally agreed that we would play it by ear, whether we need the supplementary meeting or not. So on July 1st, if we can't get through the discussion, then we would hold that supplementary meeting so that we stay on task and in time, knowing that also Echo Northwest and then Milliman will have to be doing some work in between, and they need the time to do the work. So we have to balance, the need to meet versus the work in between. And we would just make that assessment at each of the main meetings. So that's what we thought we'd do, but maybe you all have other thoughts about this meeting cadence or the topics covered. Charlie, go ahead.
So regarding meeting 5, explore mitigation strategies, especially the caps and the tax credits and exemptions. To me, that's an upfront one. That's something we need to be talking a lot about the next meeting. I mean, that's part of the nature of the tax structure and an incredibly important part of it. So I think that I'm not quite sure what you had in mind. I mean, we want
So
to
yeah,
explore
think-
what the effect is, but
yeah, I think
we ought to
you're
be
right. I think we do want to talk about that in meeting 3. To me, this is more about more explicit treatment of kind of like to what extent are we making decisions around mitigation? But I agree that's a thread that we're pulling forward in terms of. Yep.
Great.
Mary Lou.
Mine's just a practical question because I joined this group late. My understanding is if we need a second meeting in a month, it will be on the third Tuesday. Is that correct? I'm just trying to block out my calendar in case.
Yeah, my understanding is those supplemental meeting invites have gone out. I have them on my calendar. If you don't, let's make sure you do. And then what we would do, I would say probably Mimi or Isabel would cancel those if we don't need them.
Okay. But I do think, Mimi,
Okay.
is it on the third Tuesday?
I believe so.
Yes, it's on my
Yes.
calendar.
That's
Okay.
all I need. Okay, thank
Okay.
you.
And then the other thing that we'll need to do is tee up any straw proposals we might be recommending to the board. So we'll need to decide, let's say at next meeting, is there a straw proposal in here? So that we can get those written up because I mean, it's going to take some time to write those up and then get them to the board in time for the board meeting. So just wanted to put that out there. So with that, any other comments before we move to public comment, and if there is any? Thank you. This was such a productive meeting. I'm almost shocked we got through all of that. I was a little skeptical, and I've seen these slides 3 times, so that's an amazing amount of information. Thank you. So do we have any public comment, Isabel?
I do not see anyone that signed up on the call today.
Okay. So then that means we'll adjourn 5 minutes early. Thank you all for your participation. Use those 5 minutes productively. Or just
Thank you.
relax.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank
Bye-bye.
everybody. All right.
Thank you, Isabel, for getting all train running on time. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Great 4th of July.
Yeah, and happy 4th.